Welcome to Blooms and Stitches by Anne Marie. I hope you missed me last week. I apologize for not posting chapter 10 of my book, A Journey from Jamaica to Becoming. I had some technical issues. However, here is last week's verse. I hope you enjoy it. If you haven't done so, please remember to like, subscribe, share it with a friend, leave a comment under this video, and I hope you enjoy. Neonatal jaundice is a common condition that causes a newborn's skin and eyes to appear yellow. It occurs when bilirubin, a yellow pigment produced during the normal breakdown of red blood cells, builds up in a baby's bloodstream faster than the immature liver can remove it. While many newborns experience mild jaundice, babies born prematurely or following complicated pregnancies are at greater risk of developing more severe form of this condition. At 19 years old, I knew none of this. I only knew that after months of swelling, blinding headaches, and a frightening battle with preeclampsia, my daughter entered the world and was almost immediately taken from my arms to the neonatal intensive care unit. What should have been one of the happiest moments of my life became a confusing mixture of fear, exhaustion, wonder, and relief. The doctor spent 4 hours stitching me after the delivery. This was my first baby, and I had been torn so badly that I suffered nerve damages. No amount of medication seemed capable of dulling the pain. I cried until I was hoarse and immediately fell asleep after the ordeal was over. When I was finally wheeled into the NICU to see my baby, she looked so tiny. I became emotional just looking at her lying beneath the strange blue lights. She wore nothing but a newborn diaper, and the nurse explained that they were treating her for jaundice. I remember my mother praying for me throughout my pregnancy, and now it was my turn to pray for my own child. A mother. I was a mother. I could hardly believe it. It felt like only yesterday I'd been sitting in a primary school classroom. How could I manage? I'd never been a mother before, and I worried that I would fail miserably. When the nurse placed that tiny squirming bundles into my arm, I understood what it meant to fall completely in love. I laughed softly to myself, thinking that God must have been crazy to trust me with a child. But here we are. We spent a total of 2 weeks in the hospital before being discharged. As a new Jamaican mother, there were many traditions and rules to observe. Chief amongst them was that there was no visitors for at least 2 weeks or until the baby was christened, whichever came first. No matter how hard I tried, my baby would not breastfeed. I produced plenty of milk and worked tirelessly to express the milk into bottles for her. She just would not take it. When I returned home, I unpacked the many gifts my coworkers had brought to the hospital and felt grateful for every tiny outfit, blanket, and baby item I was gifted. Of course, everything had to be washed, ironed, and sanitized before it could be used. My mother insisted that I enter the room by walking backwards to prevent evil spirits from following us inside. As soon as the baby was born, she tied a piece of red satin ribbon around her wrist to ward off some same spirits. As a young mother, there were so many precautions to observe. The most enjoyable part of my day was taking early morning walks with my baby along the beach. This is Raytown Beach. My mother insisted that I wake before sunrise so the baby could breathe Kingston's fresh air, fresh morning air, that is, before businesses began releasing waste into the environment. We would walk down to the shorelines and watch the sun rise over the water before hurrying back home. Once home, I would feed her a bottle and began washing her clothes. There was no possibility of leaving baby clothes on the line after noon because, according to my mother, they had to be brought in long before then. The first week I took my baby girl for one of those walks, her father appeared as I was heading back inside. He asked if he could take the baby to meet his aunt, and reluctantly, I handed over my precious bundle and watched anxiously as he smiled down at her. There was no doubt that he loved this little girl too, but I worried about what influence he might eventually have on her life. I'd also been given strict instructions to sun my baby for the first 7 days she was home. This was the doctor's order. This meant placing her where she could absorb the gentle rays of the early morning sun. I didn't own a bassinet, so I used a baby bathtub. I folded a towel to create a soft place for her to lie, covered her eyes, and allowed her to soak up 15 minutes of precious sunshine. I was so protective that I constantly checked her pale skin to ensure she wasn't getting burned. At 6 pounds 6 ounces, she was tiny and fair skinned. Her lips were ruby red and she was completely bald. I wasn't the only person she had wrapped around her tiny fingers, though. My mother seemed to have gained a new lease on her life after the baby arrived home. It was as though she had begun aging backwards. And everyone commented that my daughter resembled her father, but many also remarked on how much she looked like my mother. My mother absolutely loved hearing that. She was endlessly supportive. During the nights, she helped me to care for the baby. My daughter was incredibly calm and smiled often without being prompted. I found myself staring at her for long stretches of time, silently promising to love and protect her with every fiber of my being. The only disappointment I experienced was my inability to breastfeed successfully. I felt that that was a barrier to bonding with my daughter, or one of the barriers. In the hospital, the nurses tried everything to encourage her to latch, but nothing worked. I had to express my colostrum, which they spoon fed to her. Once I got home, things became even harder. By the second week, I was producing very little milk and felt as though I had failed my baby. Then, my breasts suddenly swelled to nearly 3 times their normal size and felt like enormous boulders on my chest. At one point, I developed a fever. My mother boiled water and encouraged me to bathe my breasts with hot compresses. This allowed the milk to begin flowing, but the pain was almost unbearable. One day, I overheard my mother speaking with some of the older women in the community. Their collective wisdom suggested that I squeeze my milk into an ant's nest, believing that this would stop me from producing milk that the baby no longer wanted. Desperate, I followed their advice. I continued doing so until my 2 week follow up appointment at the maternity ward. Despite everything, the milk continued to come. The midwife informed the doctor, who prescribed medication to stop the production of my milk. Even then, the decision was made reluctantly, and only after they discovered a large painful lump beneath one of my arms. My mother and I also had our own hilarious disagreement about how to raise my daughter. See, she secretly hid all my newborn disposable diapers. She insisted that I use only cloth nappies because, according to her, disposable diapers would prevent the baby from developing a nice curvy shape. Oh my God. Imagine my surprise when the nurse asked me for a diaper in the delivery room and all I could find were cotton nappies. Anyway, I had no idea that my mother had quietly removed the disposable diapers and replaced them with what she proudly called bird's eye nappies. These were the softest cotton nappies that could be found in Jamaica. Washing those white cotton nappies was no easy task either. The first stool my daughter produced was black and sticky and had to be scrubbed vigorously before being boiled and hung on the line. And if there was even a speck of dirt on the baby's clothes, they had to be re-washed again, according to my mother. Under no circumstances was I allowed to use bleach on the baby's clothes. Once the clothes were dry, every item had to be ironed before being put away, or it can't be used on my baby's skin. That included my own house dresses and nightgowns as well, because according to mommy, my baby was going to be rubbing upon my clothes, and therefore I had to make sure that it's clean and be great for the baby. Mommy was also insistent that I wear a belly band, and she had made a miniature one for my baby as well. So she made both for me and my baby. According to her, the belly band would ensure that all my internal organs return to their proper place and prevent me from developing a large stomach after I had healed from childbirth. The baby's belly band served a different purpose. It was meant to protect the umbilical cord stump from germs and prevent it from falling off and touching the ground. Apparently, the older women believed that if the cord touched the earth, it could bring serious consequences for the child. Once the cord fell off, it was to be stored safely until it was buried at the foot of a healthy fruit tree. Even though I'm laughing at these things, I still followed along because a lot of the babies that these older ladies grew, they grew very healthy and happy. At times, these endless precautions seemed hilarious, but I humored my mother and respected her wishes. There was one tradition, however, where I drew the line. My mother noticed that my baby had developed small swollen areas on her chest caused by hormones passed from me during pregnancy. This was common in newborns, but my mother insisted that I should squeeze the milk from the baby's chest, which is the baby's nipples. According to her, if I didn't, my daughter would grow up with smelly armpits. Oh my God. The moment I saw how much pain it caused my baby, I firmly said no. To her credit, my mother respected my decision and never attempted that again. Watching her squeeze my baby's chest brought back memories of my own childhood. As a child, I developed an eye infection that Jamaicans commonly call pink eye. Instead of taking me to the doctor, my mother brought me to a woman in our community who had recently given birth to a baby boy. Every morning before sunrise, mommy would drag me to the woman's house so she could squeeze breast milk directly into my eyes. I was mortified. Not only was I horrified by the procedure itself, but I was also overwhelmed by the woman's enormous chest and strong body odor that greeted us each morning. I tried explaining my discomfort to my mother, but she would simply tell me to stop crying and stop embarrassing her. This ritual continued for 4 mornings. By the fifth morning, I felt nauseated just standing there. The woman was breastfeeding her baby while preparing to administer my treatment, and I had reached my limit. At that moment, I decided that whatever punishment awaited me would be worth escaping 2 more days of this ordeal. So, as I was being held still and the woman leaned forward to squeeze drops of breast milk into my eyes, I opened my mouth wide and sank my teeth into her breast. Immediately, I tasted something metallic, but before I could process what it was, a sharp slap landed across my face. Terrified, I bolted towards the door and ran. Needless to say, I received a thorough flogging from my mother afterward. But I didn't care. In my opinion, it was worth every lash because my mother finally gave up and took me to a doctor who prescribed antibiotics for my high infection. Remembering that incident all those years later reminded me that there were boundaries to what could and could not be done to my daughter. In Jamaica, maternity leave at the time lasted only 2 or 3 months. My baby was barely 6 weeks old when I was approached about returning to work early. I couldn't believe they were asking this. I'd barely begun bonding with my daughter. She was still refusing to breastfeed, and my mother had already taken over caring for her during the nights. So during the day, every waking moment revolved around me bonding with my baby girl. The request felt insensitive to me. Unfortunately, I'd only recently secured a permanent position and felt unable to refuse the request. What was presented as a request felt more like a command, and I resented the hospital staff for it. I also knew I had little choice. Much of my maternity leave had already been used while I was in the hospital before the birth of my baby. The hospital did not provide paid leave, and my savings was rapidly disappearing. Meanwhile, my daughter's father contributed almost nothing financially. Occasionally, he would spend 30 minutes babysitting, but that was the extent of his involvement. To make matters worse, he invited me to visit him with the baby, and I completely ignored that invitation. There was no way I was allowing him anywhere near me after discovering his involvement with a 14-year-old girl. When he suggested a name for my daughter, I was stunned. It was the same name as the 14-year-old girl. If I could have slapped him twice across the face, I would have. But I knew there were consequences, so I simply refused and told him to choose another name. By then, I'd long accepted that financial assistance from him was a thing of the past. I made up my mind that I would do whatever was necessary to provide for my daughter, even if it meant returning to work sooner than I had planned. My mother once again told me not to worry, that she would be there for me. She sent for my second eldest sister just for a short while, and together the three of us rallied around the baby. I'd only been back to work for a few days when my mother brought my daughter to the hospital clinic for her 6 weeks checkup. At the time, I worked as part of the administrative staff in the accident and emergency department. The hospital was undergoing major expansion and was actively recruiting staff to support its growth. Unfortunately, this also meant that the existing workplace was stretched thin while patient numbers continued to rise. I worked rotating shifts, including overnight shifts 7 p.m. until 7 a.m. the next morning. I thank God repeatedly for my mother, who had become my greatest source of strength and my daughter's primary caregiver. By 6 weeks old, my daughter weighed 14 pounds. By 3 months, she had earned the nickname Big Red because she was so delightfully chubby and incredibly fair skinned. That's Jamaicans for you. They will find every nickname in the book to give to you. I no longer cared that her father contributed very little to her. I earned my own money, paid my own bill, and was taking care of my child. As far as I was concerned, he could go to hell. Still, I believe my daughter deserved to know her father, so I never cut him off completely. Besides, he was still involved with gangs, and I understood that making him an enemy could be dangerous for not just myself, but my daughter and my mother as well. Instead, I focused on the future. I wanted a larger home where my mother and daughter could be comfortable. I wanted to return to school and earn a degree. My daughter inspired me to dream bigger than I ever had before. I wanted her to see what a strong woman looked like. I wanted her to grow up in a better environment than the one I'd known. My joy overflowed when I was accepted into the business administration program at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. The first year would cost $24,000, and for us, that was a lot. I didn't have that kind of money available all at once. At the same time, an old rundown property across the street from our home had come up for sale. I reasoned that I could apply for a housing trust loan through the National Housing Trust and purchase it. Using the little savings I had, I approached the NHT and began the application process. Mommy and I were so excited. Yes, the property was located in the same neighborhood, but we had learned how to mind our business and stay out of trouble. More importantly, it was a most affordable path towards owning our own home. And then we reasoned that we could always resell it and use resale money for a deposit on another home outside of the community. I needed to hire a surveyor and submit the property survey to the National Housing Trust. I had no idea where to find one, but the NHT provided several recommendations and I contacted one immediately. Then, just as I was navigating the home buying process, my university acceptance arrived. I felt torn. There was simply not enough money to do both. Once again, my mother came through for me. I nearly cried when she told me that she had been quietly saving money. Between the grocery money I gave her and the small allowance I insisted she accepted for helping my daughter, she had managed to put aside enough money to pay for the first semester, not for the entire year, but for the first semester. At that moment, I felt as though my daughter had brought nothing but blessings and good luck into my life. For the first time in a long time, it felt as though everything was finally beginning to turn around for me. My mother's only condition was that I allow her to start selling diapers and small household items from home, similar to the tiny yard shops that many people operated within the community. After confirming that the young woman who had inherited the property had no objections, I happily agreed. At work, we were not yet unionized, so negotiating a schedule that would allow me to attend school while maintaining my job proved difficult. The only solution management offered was a position as a supervisor at the night shift administrative staff in the emergency department. No one wanted that position. The team consisted entirely of men who had developed a reputation for chronic lateness, disrespect towards medical staff, and making life miserable for their supervisors. On top of that, the ER department handled some of the most gruesome cases imaginable. It was not a place for the faint of heart. Still, this was the only position that would allow me to begin university in September. Without fully understanding what I was getting into, I accepted the position. The first sign of trouble came when I had to intervene in a heated argument between a medical student and one of my team members. When I asked that all concerns involving external staff be brought directly to me, my instruction was completely ignored by my team members. At first, I dismissed it as frustration in the heat of the moment. Soon, however, I began noticing a pattern. Staff members would arrive 1 or 2 hours late, others would clock in and then disappear somewhere in the hospital to hide. My authority to discipline them was extremely limited. You see, Human Resources Office operated between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Mondays through to Fridays, which meant that there was no immediate support during the night shifts. Complaints often took days to be addressed. By November, I deeply regretted my decision. The stress of working nights, attending university during the day, caring for a young baby, dealing with a baby's father who was becoming increasingly threatening, and functioning on very little sleep was taking its toll. Financially, I was drowning as well. The cost of textbooks, university fees, and property to survey had completely depleted both my mother and I's savings. I explored student loans, but at the time in Jamaica, obtaining one required a guarantor or some form of surety. I had neither. I'd arranged a payment plan with the university, but the next installment was due in December. As if that weren't enough, the housing trust informed me that there would be additional expenses outside of the housing loan that I would need to cover myself. I had not saved a single dollar towards those costs. Slowly, I felt myself sinking into depression. The pressure affected every aspect of my life, and I began arguing with my mother almost daily. And the close relationship we had always enjoyed started becoming so strained. At the same time, my mother's attention was increasingly divided between her business and the baby that I wanted her to care for. Her small yard shop had grown into a thriving business on the veranda, and I would often return home from classes to find my daughter sitting in a heavily soaked diaper. That alone by itself didn't bother me too much. What concerned me was that there were severe rashes that began appearing on her skin, which tells me that the diaper was on her body for quite a while. Even though I ignored my daughter's father whenever possible, I knew he had noticed them too because he began commenting on them. But in my mind, I think that he could have played a bigger role than he was. One of my days off was supposed to be spent washing and cleaning our room. Instead, it turned into a full scale argument between my mother and I. By the time we went to bed that night, I'd already begun thinking about how I might find additional help caring for my daughter during the days that I was at school. At approximately 2 a.m. that day, the telephone I had recently installed into our room rang. It was the hospital. I grimaced as soon as I heard the reason for the call. No one had shown up for work. Wouldn't you know it? That meant I had to go since nobody else was there and because I was a supervisor. Those overgrown man babies were angry that I'd reported their behavior and had apparently decided not to report for duty just out of spite. Taking a deep breath and swallowing my pride, I informed my mother that I needed to go in, and she agreed to take care of the baby. By 3:30 a.m., my taxi was pulling into the ER department. The scene was chaos. Police cars filled the parking lot with flashing lights, sirens wailed, people shouting. The waiting room was packed. I barely had time to settle into my station before I began registering patients. The first patient arrived accompanied by a police officer. A screwdriver protruded from his left eye socket. Can you believe that? A screwdriver. There was surprisingly little blood coming from the eye socket, which indicated that there may have been blood inside of his skull. I stared in disbelief, wondering whether or not I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The officer glanced at me through the protective glass cage that I was sitting in, and he said, "Yeah, man, this happened when you try to rob people house," suggesting that the man with the screwdriver in his eyes had tried to rob somebody's house and they stabbed him in his eyes with the screwdriver. The registration itself became a blur. What happened next would change everything. Another man had been standing quietly in line while I completed the first registration. At first glance, he appeared perfectly fine. Nothing could prepare me for what happened next. He sat down in the chair outside of my glass cage enclosure and slid a small piece of paper towards me. When I greeted him, he didn't respond. I assumed that he simply didn't want to be there, and neither did I. I picked up the note and read, Register quickly, please. Room 5. Those words would remain etched into my memory for years. As I looked up at him, his jaw suddenly tightened, then it relaxed. It was as though he yawned without opening his mouth. The next moment, he slipped from the chair and hit the floor with a heavy thud. For a second, I simply stared at the empty chair in confusion. Then I stood up to see what foolishness this man was up to. The man was laid sprawled across the floor as though he had fallen asleep. A thin stream of bright red blood trickled from his nose, and the whites of his eyes were visible. I rushed around the enclosure to get a better look and to see what I could do to help. And people in the waiting room began to shout for doctors and nurse and shout for help. The man started to convulsing violently. Foam appeared at his mouth, and his clothing became wet beneath him as though he had urinated on himself. Someone screamed. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire room. I turned to see who was screaming, but everybody was looking at me. The scream was coming from me, and then everything went blank. It felt cold. Something was attached to my hand and was sticking into my skin. As I slowly opened my eyes, the harsh hospital lights blinded me. Confused, I raised a hand to shield my face. Then the memories came rushing back. I fought back another scream as tears stung my eyes. I was lying in one of the curtain treatment bays in the emergency department, and then a voice suddenly cautioned me not to sit up too quickly. Apparently, I'd fainted after witnessing the patient collapse. I could hardly believe it. I'd seen critically ill patients before, after all. I'd seen people on the brink of death. Why this incident had affected me so much, so deeply, I couldn't understand. The doctors informed me that they had managed to contact the CEO who would approve my going home if it was necessary. If it was necessary? Of course it was. I couldn't stay there another minute. I then looked at my watch and was shocked to discover that it was nearly 9 a.m. An hour later, I was examined by another doctor who explained that I had experienced a severe shock reaction. He recommended several days of rest and advised me to monitor for signs of concussion because I had struck my head when I fainted. After receiving additional instructions and attention, I finally went home. A few days later, I submitted a formal request to Human Resource Department asking them to be transferred from the emergency administrative area. The request was flat out denied. The anger I felt was immediate and overwhelming, and without fully considering the consequences, I submitted my resignation effective immediately. You see, I was calling the hospital's bluff. I believe they needed me more than I needed them. I fully expected HR to contact me and to persuade me to stay, maybe even offer a solution. Instead, I learned a painful lesson. I was playing poker without fully understanding the rules of the game called life. They never called back. And for the next year, I would fight relentlessly to survive in a world that seemed determined to tear me down. If you're still listening to this week's chapter of my audiobook, A Journey from Jamaica to Becoming, I want to tell you a big thank you for sticking around. If this is your first listen, please go ahead and listen to my other audiobooks leading up to this chapter. Remember to subscribe if you haven't done so. Click the notification bell so that you're notified when new chapters come online, or if I have other videos that I'm posting to my playlist. I really do have some new videos that I'm uploading for the summer. Exciting things to come. Leave a comment, please, and remember to share it with your friends. As usual, from Blooms and Stitches by Anne-Marie, thank you so much for listening and sticking around. Until I see you in the next one.